Just when you thought the noise around Ohio State couldn't get any louder, two influential voices decided to grab a microphone and say, "Watch this." Welcome to the podcast daily. It is Monday. That's Bill Landis. I am Austin Ward. And friend of the program, Adam King, was out last week talking to Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel, a couple guys who know a lot about Ohio State football, a lot about winning a national championship, and a lot about the pressure that comes with being the head coach of the Buckeyes. And knowing all that, that's why I was surprised to hear them say, you know what, Ryan Day, you've got the greatest roster ever assembled.
It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. Like, it's not that they're necessarily wrong, but it's surprising to hear it come out of their mouths because, to your point, if either one of them were in Ryan Day's current shoes and like Ryan Day were in their shoes and he did the same thing, they would be very angry about that. I would imagine they would not want they don't want rat poison coming from within the building. You know what I mean? Like, that's supposed to come from us. It's not supposed to come from people who are part of the program or used to be part of the program. So it's kind of funny, but not unfounded opinions. I don't think by either Urban Meyer or Jim Tressel. I think there could be onto something.
Yeah, and if you didn't see him, Adam King has those up on his social media account there on X. But it gets right to the point. Urban Meyer says, "Well, it's one of the most talented rosters of the last decade, if not ever." And then Jim Tressel, in a more Tressel-like understated way, says, "I don't know that I've ever seen that many great players all in the Woody all at the same time." Now they're both getting at the same point that this roster has everything that Ohio State could possibly need. That in itself is not newsworthy. It's pretty obvious to your point, Bill. Like, I think we can all agree that it's either Ohio State or Georgia, the most talented rosters in the country. And I think Ohio State's got a really good case that theirs is number one. Is it the best of the last decade or the best of all time? That remains to be seen. And that's a lot of extra hype to be throwing on the team in late June. Now, it's not out of bounds to do it. I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with what they said. And I kind of brushed it aside and was like, well, that seems pretty obvious. Everyone's excited at Ohio State, including Urban Meyer, including Jim Tressel. I don't think there's anything that's nefarious about it to try and undermine. Like, Urban Meyer hired Ryan Day, and Jim Tressel has been around the program way more this summer than I've ever seen. In fact, after those comments, I know that Ryan Day wasn't upset about it because Jim Tressel was at the coaches golf outing with him on Thursday. He spent all morning out there at Scarlet. It's been cool to see him around the Buckeyes, but the underlying point here is, like, wonder what they would have thought about Earl Bruce and John Cooper being like, you know what, guy, we've been in that seat and you have to win a natty.
Yeah, I don't. Ryan Day knows the roster's good. He put it together, right? So I don't think he's actually angry about that. But yeah, and honestly, I don't know. It gives us something to talk about, right? But from Ryan Day's point of view, it probably doesn't add any more pressure than he was already feeling. I can't imagine it's possible for him to feel more pressure probably than he was already feeling to try to get Ohio State over that hump and win a national title this year, which is why, like, I've been borderline impressed with sort of like how he's carried himself this offseason, because I don't know that he wears that, right? I think we all would rightly assume that it's there, that he feels it every day when he wakes up in the morning and goes to the Woody. Like, he knows what the ask is, and he knows how he's positioned this team. But for whatever reason, I don't know what it would be. It's probably a couple of different reasons. He seems to be rather confident, like, in the team's ability to do that. He's not out there pounding his chest, but I think we'd be able to tell, like, if that was weighing on him at all. And I just don't get the sense that it is. But I don't know. Maybe it does add a little more to it. What Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel say. I will say this about Urban: like, everything Urban says or everything Urban characterizes is something ever. Like, it's always an absolute. It's never like, oh, this could be pretty good. It's like, nope, this might be the best thing we've ever seen in my entire life. Can you believe it? So I would take that with a grain of salt, clearly, because, like, he might have had the best roster Ohio State's ever had in 2014 and 2015, and certainly Jim Tressel had some really good rosters too. I find Jim Tressel's kind of like placing all this a little more interesting than I do Urban Meyer's, because Urban is also like he's not a quasi commentator. He's a commentator now. He's on Fox every week talking about college football. Jim Tressel, like, doesn't have to be out there giving his opinions about Ohio State football. It doesn't have to be really like as present as I feel like he's been over this last year, sort of what I kind of view as like forging a new kind of relationship with Ryan Day. And I don't know how either one of them would characterize that. Might be too much to say that Jim Tressel is mentoring Ryan Day, but I do think they have seemed to grow closer over this last year. So I'd imagine a lot of what Jim Tressel says about Ohio State football is probably things that he and Ryan Day have already talked about. So for him to say what he said about Ohio State's roster, I think is just a reflection of how confident Ryan Day probably feels in the whole thing.
I do think there's probably something more to get into there down the road with, Jim Tressel being around. Ryan Day brought him up. I don't know which winter update it was that with Ryan Day, Bill, when he said, "Oh, I was talking." It was about the Parker Fleming, departure and how Ohio State was going to manage special teams. And he's like, "Well, I talked about this with Jim Tressel and his influence and how he thought that assistants had more buy-in and their players had more buy-in if they were all chipping in collaboratively and collectively to special teams." And that was kind of like the first time that I can ever remember Ryan Day talking about a conversation or feedback input from Jim Tressel. And that's happened, I don't know, pretty regularly throughout this offseason, including Thursday out there at Scarlet, where Jim Tressel was on the microphone first and then handed it to Ryan Day before the event started on Thursday morning. So you see, obviously, he's not at Youngstown State anymore. He's retired from that role. He has more bandwidth, Jim Tressel does. And I think he's also warmly welcomed around here in a way that, I don't want this to come out wrong. Generally, your predecessor, like Urban Meyer, is trying to forge a different path for Ohio State than what the guy before him did. And he wanted to make the program his own. And having Jim Tressel around was probably not going to be productive for that. They also competed against each other pretty famously for some trophies when he was at Florida. So that maybe their relationship was not ever going to be a natural fit the way that you tend to see it, where this select club, this fraternity of Ohio State coaches, they all tend to get along very well. And now Jim Tressel, I never felt like Ryan Day was pushing either Urban Meyer or Jim Tressel away. Definitely not Urban Meyer when they were working together. But like Jim Tressel didn't have the time to be around. And now Ryan Day's like, "Hey, come on down, like be around Columbus and let's talk ball. And there aren't many people who can relate to the job that Ryan Day has in a way that Jim Tressel can."
No, certainly not. What's Ohio State's had, 5, including Woody, is it 5 head coaches, 6 head coaches? So like not many people have held this job in the last 70 years. So it's good to have him around. I do like the Urban and Jim Tressel things. Like Urban had 2 national championship rings. Like he probably didn't feel like he needed advice from anybody, and nor do I necessarily blame him for that, given where he was in his career compared to where Ryan Day is now. Is still like a relatively new head coach. I know it seems like he's been here forever, but it hasn't been quite that long. So it would make sense to me that he would seek out advice from people that he trusts, from people that sort of understand the job that he's dealing with. But another layer to it that I do find interesting is like I have, and Doug and I have talked about this, and I think maybe you and Byrne probably agree. Maybe we've talked about it too. Like Ryan Day on some level like feels like a combination of both Urban and Jim Tressel, sort of like maybe I don't want to say the best of both of them combined, because that then we're talking about like, the greatest coach ever. Like I don't want to put that on them, but they're
okay. little urbanism coming out of you.
Yeah. They're right. There are characteristics of both that I consider strengths that I do think Ryan Day has. He doesn't have maybe everything that made both those guys great, but it's not a bad thing to combine some of what each had. And obviously he got to learn under Urban. I don't know how much learning he did in Florida. I'm sure Urban had no idea who Ryan Day was when they were in Florida, but when Ryan Day was a GA, but clearly Ryan got to learn that when he was here in Columbus. And now he's like kind of getting the opportunity to probably tap into the other side of that more by taking anything from Jim Tressel, like just probably even just like being around him without actively seeking advice is probably helpful, just to kind of like see the way he carries himself. And I'm sure Jim Tressel strikes me as someone too who's not going to just like walk around the building and like speak his mind and tell everyone what he thinks without being asked. Like I think he'd be sort of respectful of the position that Ryan Day is in, and know maybe when some advice might be needed, and know when to take a step back and just sort of always be there for Ryan Day if and when Ryan Day feels like he needs him to be. So I'm interested like in that and what that might mean for the evolution of Ryan Day as head coach. Because I would say, I guess I didn't cover Trestle, so I don't know, but I would say that Urban and Tress are probably two different examples of ways to do it, but good examples of like the CEO, kind of head coach that Ryan Day I think is trying to be now moving forward for Ohio State. So this could help him, down a road that I'd imagine is still not quite entirely comfortable for him.
Yeah. Initially, when these comments were made, I kind of moved on, brushed them aside. It's like, well, yeah, of course, Ohio State's roster is good, and there would be no sense in Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel pretending that it's not. And I just been continued to be asked about it, like on radio appearances and stuff throughout the week, and I was like, is this a bigger deal than like I thought? And I don't think that it necessarily is. I think it is unusual, I think, for previous coaches they don't want to add to the strain of the job. And I don't think even that they were trying to do that. They were giving honest feedback to fair questions about a team that's really, really freaking talented.
Yeah.
And I guess the other part, Bill, that like didn't make it stand out to me as a major deal is because you have Denzel Burke and Lathan Ransom in that building saying it's natty or bust. You have certainly the fan base part of that, the media coverage of this team as a top two, as a national title contender already is what it is. That's not going to change. But in the building, they have not shied away from that. And Ryan Day, I don't think it would change anything or bother him because he made this point on Tuesday, which is the same point he's made dating back to his first press conference. Like, oh, you don't think that there's pressure to win every game? Try losing one. I don't know how many times we've heard him say it. Like, it's beat the team up north and then win every other game on top of that. Like, that's always been the standard and the expectation for him. And he hasn't beat Michigan in the last 3 years. So he knows that he's not met that bar and knows that there is going to be negative feedback that comes with that. But he's maintained that same message throughout. So he knows what is in that locker room. The people in that locker room are already saying they're going even further. Like Urban Meyer and Jim Trestle didn't say, oh, Ohio State has to win the national championship or this is a failure. They didn't say that. And I think that they're both smart enough to have walked up to that line.
Could you imagine?
Now, if they had said that, we wouldn't have waited 5 days to have this conversation. That would have been very, very different. So they didn't do that. And that's always like, all right, well, I think there is something an interesting dynamic at play there, but it still doesn't go as far as like, I think it's more noteworthy when Denzel Burke is saying it even than Jim Tressel, Urban Meyer in that regard.
Yeah, I get like it's the old adage, like, nobody can put more pressure on you than yourself, right? So Ohio State is certainly has taken up that mantle this offseason. They're talking the talk. We'll see how it goes in the season, but they're just as confident in the roster as Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel are. And the other part about that too is like Urban grew up in Ashtabula and Tress grew up in Mentor. They're Ohio State fans, man. They're excited about how good Ohio State could potentially be this year. It'd be like if I went to a bar down the street from my house and said, "What do you think about the roster?" I bet I'd find 10 people. It's like, this is one of the best rosters I've ever seen. I can't wait to see them on the field this fall, right? So that's of course like Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel are former Ohio State coaches, and that is how the world knows them. But they're also like they're Buckeyes, man. Like they're pumped about what this team could be, and I think they should be.
And I think that's the other part. Like they have to know when they say it, though, because we've had these conversations. We're talking about where the Buckeyes rate in this national title race and how it compares to the 2019 roster or the 2014 roster. And then you have the Athletic, also adding a little gasoline on the fire. It's like, oh, well, this could be the most decorated recruiting or draft class of all time. It's like it all coming out at once. I do wonder, though. And I think it is important that inside the Woody, the players had already embraced this mentality 6 months ago. When the veterans came back, it was to win a national title. Like the pressure and how the Buckeyes do deal with that, I think is going to be well worth watching because there's a lot of back padding about what Ohio State has built and, the way they did it and this all-star team that they have acquired just however they did it. There's been so much talk about that it is going to add, I think, some pressure and more scrutiny and attention to them once they get into training camp, once the games start, that, if they don't win every game 50-0, I remember talking to Taylor Decker in 2015 about that, where it was like, when they didn't play perfect games, what's wrong with Ohio State? Like, well, we're trying to win football games, and other team has scholarship too. Like that does wear on teams. It does. There are still 18 to 21-year-old kids, or they look like grown ass men, most of them, but it's new. They're going to be dealing with some of these things for the first time. I think that is an interesting dynamic to watch for this team once the season gets closer.
Absolutely. Like it's just all going to land differently once the game starts. And although I suppose this was true for the 2015 team too, they did have to open at Virginia Tech, but like after it, they had some games that like should have quote unquote been a little easier for them, that they did kind of sleepwalk / at times struggle through, or didn't look as crisp maybe as people were hoping they would. So like this team will have to combat that for sure. I guess the thing that this team has that team didn't is like still the chip on its shoulder of like not getting over the hump yet, right? They're not returning national championships like marked by the rest of the sport. Even though we talked about that way just because people perceive them to have the best roster, but I think that only goes so far. I think returning obviously as national champions with all that back is a totally different animal, but it's still difficult what they'll be trying to do in the fall. And they're trying to do a thing, frankly, that has not happened a lot at Ohio State, which is like be talked about as a national title contender in the offseason and actually go out and do it, right? Their last couple national titles, they sort of like came out of nowhere to win the thing. Ohio State never sneaks up on people, but like they weren't the preseason favorite to win the national championship in 2014. They weren't the favorite to win in 2002. Like they found a way to put it together that year and win it. But there's a weight of expectation that this team will have to combat. But as you said, they all knew that when they decided to come back, and I don't think it's something that's going to catch them by surprise. And I think the fact that this roster is pretty old, and frankly that they've gotten beat a few times, I think that will help them kind of fight that off a little bit.
Yeah, they're scarred.
They are scarred. They've got scars. Yeah. To
use some more Ryan Day isms on that one. All right. Well, I'm glad that Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel had some thoughts to add, and I hope we get more of them. Maybe they need to hop on the podcast daily with us as this offseason rolls along. We can get even more thoughts about the greatest roster ever assembled from some guys who know what it takes to win at the highest level at Ohio State.
Tress has his own podcast. He's competition now.
Oh, okay. He doesn't want. Maybe it's cross pollination. We can help each other promote. Hey, he's got time. Clearly, he's at the golf course every day, or at least most of the days last week. But good for him. I would be too. Hope that's a good way for y'all to start this last week of June. Hope you're staying cool out there wherever you are in the midst of this heat wave. We've all got some vacations coming up, but we're going to try our best to keep this content rolling along, including the Ohio State coaching staff, which they got through this official visiting weekend, and they're about to take, a lot of vacations over the next 2 or 3 weeks. But we will keep the content rolling along as we take our own trips in the coming weeks before Big Ten Media Days ramps up in about a month's time. But some shows coming your way. Thanks for starting your day with us. He's Bill Landis. I'm Austin Ward. This has been the Podcast Daily for Monday, and we will talk to you later.